So you walk out of your house, you get in your car to go to work like you do every day, you turn the key, and you hear
extremely loud sound. It startled me. I actually thought I had gotten into the wrong car.
Yeah, you just got your cat converter stolen, which means you're now part of a pretty large, not at all exclusive club here in Oregon. And even though we're now more than a year and a half into the pandemic, Oregon is unfortunately dealing with its worst days yet.
I would describe this as a healthcare crisis at this point.
And it seems like our summers here in the Pacific Northwest are just always going to be filled with wildfire smoke. So let's talk about how to live with this new normal.
I don't think this is a Western U.S. problem. This is a global problem. This is a U.S.-wide problem.
Here's the story. All right, thank you for being with us. Feels like a Monday, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. A long week ahead of us to talk about all the issues surrounding your lives and what it's like living in this community and in this state and whichever city you're in. And I want to hear about it, so please let us know. Reach out. Use that email. Hit us up at thestory@kgw.com. You can also find me on Instagram or Facebook or use Twitter and the hashtag HeyDan. You know who we haven't talked about in a while? Clackamas County Chair Tootie Smith. You remember her, right? She made headlines last year for going on Fox News and saying this about Governor Kate Brown's COVID restrictions.
We do not need to be treated as second-rate slaves in our own homes.
Age is like a fine wine. Well, apparently she's still not happy about the governor's restrictions. You wouldn't expect her to be, because that's really all she's posted about on Facebook lately. Stuff about mask mandates, how they don't work, how they're violating everybody's civil liberties, all the usual talking points. Nothing really on there about the fact that Oregon hospitals, some of them, are close to being overwhelmed with a surge in COVID cases like we've never seen before, but I digress. I got this email from Mary. Mary said, when we hear a county leader like Tootie Smith enlist her supporters in attacking the governor's mask mandate, it's confusing and hurtful. She spouts misinformation, discounting all the science that supports the vaccine and how effective mask usage is. Wasn't there a movement in the fall to remove her from office? And that question brings us to our new segment, Recall Roundup. So yes, last fall, people started talking about recalling Tootie Smith. The thing is, she wasn't actually sworn into office until January, and the law says you have to wait at least 6 months to recall someone. Well, there is a website up for the recall campaign, but they haven't posted anything recently. We've reached out to the organizers, but we haven't heard back. There's also a website up to recall Smith's fellow commissioner, Mark Shull. After he took office in January, a constituent dug up a bunch of racist and Islamophobic Facebook posts that he made. Then in June, he introduced a ban on vaccine passports that compared them to Jim Crow laws, and he took some flack for that. Now, the recall websites for Smith and Shull do have pages asking people to pledge to sign the recall petition. But we asked the Secretary of State's office about this, and they told us Clackamas County Elections has not received a request to approve a petition for circulation for either Commissioner Smith or Commissioner Shull. So it doesn't look like these recall petitions have actually been filed at all yet. Now, there's another recall petition that has been filed. A group called Total Recall is trying to remove Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler from office. They're critical of his leadership, his response to the protests, this homeless crisis that we're dealing with, the heat wave, a bunch of stuff, okay? I mean, it's safe to say Wheeler isn't the most popular that he's ever been right now. But according to OPB, the recall campaign isn't getting a lot of signatures right now. The experts don't think that they're going to get the 47,000 signatures they need by that October deadline. Let's go big story, shall we? I've always wondered this, maybe you have too. Why is it so easy, or at least why does it seem so easy, for thieves to sell those catalytic converters that they steal from under people's cars? And will the state's new law to stop that actually help? Why don't we start from the top? I mean, the tippity top. This is a catalytic converter. This is what it looks like. It's under your car. It's part of the exhaust system, and it uses this mesh of precious metals to filter out all of the nasty stuff in your exhaust. And scrap yards will give you a few $100 for one. So crooks steal them and sell them for those few $100s. This is not a news story. We run these stories all of the time. When one is stolen off a bus at a senior facility, for instance, or a bunch are stolen from cars at a used car lot, the news is there. We swoop in and we tell everybody about it. Well, last month, NBC News, they said nationwide, thefts went from 108 catalytic converters per month in 2018 to $2,347 per month in December of 2020. I'm not great at math. I'm not. I'll admit that. I'll be the first to admit it. But it seems like a lot. Is 2,000% increase a lot? Math majors use the hashtag HeyDan. Now, the main reason for this spike is the price of the metals that are inside. All right, like rhodium, for instance, which right now is priced at $17,050 an ounce. And if you're wondering, is that a lot? Well, for reference, gold is currently priced at $1,780 an ounce. So again, math majors, you're up. Now, this weekend, we met this guy here. He had his cat converter stolen in broad daylight, right outside of his home. The bad guys blocked the road. They climbed under his van. They used an electric saw to hack it off. It could take actually less than 2 minutes if you're a good bad guy. And then they go and they sell them, perhaps to a scrapyard. So that inspired lawmakers in Salem to pass Senate Bill 803. This law says that scrap metal businesses can't buy these cat converters from some dude off the street. They can only buy them from commercial sellers. And they think that will be enough to help. But will it be enough to help? I mean, for instance, there are already laws to curb this sort of theft, and crooks are getting around that stuff. I mean, let me explain. Right now, for a scrap business to buy your cat converter, they need to keep a lot of records of that transaction. They need a copy of your ID. They need a photo or video of your face. They need your license plate number. And then you can only get paid by check through the mail. So there's a paper trail. And still, these thefts aren't just happening, they're spiking. How? Well, perhaps there's a black market out there. After all, rare metals are a global thing. That's what the New York Times thinks is fueling these crimes. They reported on thefts tripling in St. Louis, Lexington, Wichita, etc. 3 days ago in Portland, Maine, police found 1,000 cat converters during a theft sting. And, as math majors know, that's a lot. Multnomah County District Attorney Mike Schmidt is over the whole thing. He says the black market is exploding and he wants to crack down, like in this Willamette Week article from March, where man who stole catalytic converter from Prius parked at Portland Library is sentenced to 366 days in prison after the DA tied an unlawful use of a motor vehicle charge to that crime and arranged a plea deal. So, it kind of sounds like the groundwork is set. The crime has the attention of lawmakers. The DA wants to be aggressive, so we turn to police. And we asked them, are you going to be able to do your part? To which they replied, most investigative resources are dedicated to person crimes. There are 4 detectives assigned to all property crimes. So, no. The Portland Police does not have sufficient resources to follow up on property cases. But maybe you wanted to look at the numbers yourself to see if 4 detectives could possibly be enough for the workload. So let's look at the stats. These are the crime numbers from the last year. Catalytic converter theft is filed under larceny. And since June of 2020, there have been almost 24,000 of those. So, math majors? All right, let's count some vaccines. We like to do that. More than 2.61 million Oregonians have gotten at least their first dose. That's about 62% of the state's entire population. Everybody, every man, woman, child, kids, even under 12 if they can't get vaccinated yet. In Washington, more than 5 million people have gotten at least their first dose. That works out to be about 66% of their entire population, including kids. So this should give you an idea of how many people are protected in some way from COVID and how many people are not. OHSU said today that every single patient, everyone in its ICU, is unvaccinated. So with that, let's talk to Pat Doors for just a moment. Pat, what can you tell us?
Well, Dan, in some parts of the state, there are real problems with COVID patients overloading the hospitals. I talked to Asante Three Rivers down in Grants Pass, and they're having huge problems down there. They said that typically they have 125 beds. That's what they're licensed for. But because they've had so many people coming in now, they've had an emergency order from the state to be able to take care of 161. And they're not really sure what's going to happen next, because they have all these COVID patients coming in on top of all of their regular patients. When I was talking to the CEO earlier today, he said there were 44 patients in the ER waiting room and that 14 of them needed beds, and he wasn't sure where they were going to be able to put them.
Wow. So as we look at the numbers and then into the future, we can see how many people are being tested, are testing positive for COVID. We know how many people are getting vaccinated. We know how many beds are being made up. So as we look into the future, how dire is this, and how much more do they expect this to get worse?
Well, they do expect it to get worse for the next 2 or 3 weeks, according to the study by OHSU. This is just starting to ramp up. And, even if you got vaccinated today, it would not stop this fifth surge from crescendoing. So that's why they're doing the mask, to try and just at least slow it down just a little bit. But things are looking ugly. And it's going to be very interesting to see how the hospitals are able to manage this moving forward. OHSU estimates that at the peak in like the first week of September, maybe we'll be short 500 hospital beds statewide. That will be a very dire situation.
Hard to believe that we are back talking about this in the way that we're discussing it, but I guess it's time for all of us to get over that shock and deal with the reality. Pat, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Now, we're about halfway through our fire season, and we've seen some pretty big fires in the Northwest so far. I mean, it could be worse. We know that. And we look at last year, and we know how much worse it could be. I think a lot of people on the West Coast have seen how bad this can get. So this week we are partnering with our sister stations up and down the West Coast for a series called Scorched Earth. And we're starting off tonight with a story from Keely Chalmers. She has a look at how wildfire smoke travels so far and what we can do in the future to make sure that the air we breathe is clean.
They are big, destructive.
It's all around us.
And as our climate continues to warm,
we're still trying to wake some people up and get them out of here.
They will get worse. We've watched as massive wildfires devour forests, towns, and neighborhoods, but their impact is felt much farther away. Because where there are flames, there's also smoke that can travel long distances. This season, we've watched smoke from fires burning along the West Coast.
Unfortunately, the haze is coming at the expense of some massive wildfires out west.
Blew across the country.
Yeah, it's a U.S.-wide problem. I mean, even if the fires are contained to the western U.S., we're seeing impacts across the continental U.S.
It's a phenomenon Portland State University Assistant Professor Elliot Gall has been studying.
So we've always known that, large-scale wildfire events can impact entire regions and, in fact, have global impact. But I think as we see hotter and drier summers, we're seeing larger fires.
And the larger the fire, the more its smoke will travel. Here's why. A large fire can actually generate its own weather and create conditions that allow the smoke to reach the upper levels of the atmosphere. Those upper levels are where you'll find the jet stream, strong and consistent winds that can push smoke over great distances, causing not only hazy conditions, but also serious health problems.
As I understand, New York City saw an air quality index of over 150 during those few weeks when they were, impacted by the fires in the West. And that's a level that's sort of of acute concern to the general population.
Gall and many scientists are tracking the movement of wood smoke through low-cost sensor networks like this one.
This sensor here is called a purple air sensor.
These sensors measure the levels of particulate matter in the smoke. You can see even in cities far from the wildfires.
So let's pan over and take a look at what's happening in Denver.
The levels are disturbingly high.
We're seeing air quality indexes of 140, 150. These are levels of outdoor particulate matter that the general population should be concerned about.
Which raises the question, if a warming climate will lead to more and larger wildfires, is there anything we can do to protect ourselves?
Experts say better forest management will be critical because once the fire starts, there is little that can be done to remove the pollutants from the atmosphere. What we can do, says Gall, is to at least remove them from our homes as much as possible.
Preparedness is really key.
Number one, invest in a mechanical filter, a filter that filters out those wood smoke particles. Secondly, purchase an air cleaner, something Gall says we should all have regardless.
But if you purchase an air cleaner and use it regularly, there is a robust body of evidence that shows it will improve your health over the long term if you use it regularly.
And lastly, create what's called a clean room in your home.
Basically, selecting a zone in your home and emphasizing and focusing your resources in a small zone of your home like a bedroom.
This is something even the EPA recommends we all do, because scientists realize as our climate warms, large-scale fires will become more frequent.
And so, I don't think this is a Western U.S. problem. This is a global problem. This is a U.S.-wide problem. It's one we collectively need to work together and address.
Keely Chalmers, KGW News.
For a lot of people, the situation right now in Afghanistan seems all too familiar.
And many are drawing comparisons to what's happening here today to the American withdrawal from Saigon.
So let's take a look back in the KGW vault at kids evacuated out of Vietnam to find new homes in Oregon.
A fitting end to our longest, most expensive, and most divisive war.
If that didn't happen, I wouldn't be here today.
When the story continues. Welcome back. As always, getting really smart and thoughtful questions and comments on our coverage so far. I'll address a few as we end the show tonight, as I always do at the end of each half hour here on The Story. But please keep them coming. Send us emails to thestory@kgw.com and use that hashtag HeyDan on Twitter. Now, there's a little saying. They say all news is local, even when it's happening on the other side of the world. And the situation in Afghanistan is certainly impacting a lot of people back here, service members, veterans, immigrants, and refugees who live in our area. But we just discovered another connection between the now former leader of Afghanistan and Lake Oswego, of all places. This is Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan, who fled the country over the weekend. He's been in power since 2014. Obviously, he's not anymore now that the presidential palace looks like the picture on the right, since the Taliban took over Kabul and the rest of the country. It's not clear where President Ghani is now. Some reports say Uzbekistan, maybe, and that he's hoping to fly to the U.S. Turns out he's actually lived here before, not just in the U.S., but in Oregon. In the 60s, Ghani attended Lake Oswego High School as an exchange student. The Lake Oswego Review did a story about it back in 2015, complete with a photo in the yearbook from his 1967 graduating class. The newspaper says he served on the student council, so I guess he was into politics pretty early on. He went on to study at Columbia University, where he got his PhD, and taught at UC Berkeley and Johns Hopkins University. Now, I'm sure you've seen a lot of the photos and the videos coming out of Afghanistan of people trying to get out of that country any way that they can. The airport in Kabul is overrun with hundreds of people. You can see it in this video that I've been just struck by, I'm sure you have all day, of citizens trying to cling to a U.S. Air Force jet taking off. Several people did stay on that plane as it took off, and then they died falling from the plane. Now, if you were alive during the Vietnam War, if you're familiar with history, these scenes probably remind you of the fall of Saigon in 1975. Americans and Vietnamese scrambled onto planes to evacuate, and a lot of people tried to climb the wall of the U.S. Embassy to get in to find refuge. Some of those evacuated from Vietnam were just kids, were children. It was called Operation Baby Lift. And an adoption agency based in Oregon helped get some of them out. A few years ago, Tracy Berry tracked down a woman who ended up in Oregon after being evacuated as a baby. Let's go into the KGW vault.
The evacuation was frantic, a fitting end to our longest, most expensive, and most divisive war.
I'll tell you, the images up here and in here are pretty vivid. Said, you have to leave now. She was a social worker for Holt.
John Williams was working in Saigon for Holt International as the war enveloped them.
Clearly a very tense time and a time of great uncertainty.
When it became clear that Saigon would fall to the North Vietnamese, Holt had 400 children in their care. They wanted to get them out. Then President Ford made a critical call. South Vietnamese children in the process of being adopted in the U.S. would be allowed to leave, flown out on government planes. Operation Baby Lift was born. Holt was offered the first plane out, a cargo jet, but passed. They had already chartered a different plane for the next day. That cargo jet crashed shortly after takeoff.
And, you know, many of our friends were on that plane.
The next day, the Pan Am 747, filled with 409 children and 50 adults, including John, took off. Each grown-up was assigned 10 kids to care for.
It was no free ride, I'll guarantee you that.
Oh, it was a long, loud, chaotic trip with stops in Guam and Hawaii, before finally making it to Seattle, then on to the East Coast, with children joining their new families along the way.
They're beautiful.
With the children delivered, John and the two other American Holt workers immediately headed back to Saigon. They needed to get their Vietnamese staff and 30 more children to safety before the airport shut down. The children made it. The staff didn't.
Some of them we know what happened to, and many of them we don't. But that was tough. That was tough.
Jody Willis was one of those children.
And I was 5 pounds, 12 ounces, and I was 6 weeks old. So I was teeny. You were handed to us at the Portland airport.
Jody was welcomed with a great celebration by her new family in Springfield, Oregon. Their joy expressed in every page of her carefully crafted baby book.
They told us about a special little tiny baby girl.
She joined a sister adopted from South Korea. Eventually, the family would grow to 4 children. She always knew her adoption story, but didn't always understand it.
And even you hear about it as a child, you don't get the concept of war and abandonment.
And the more she understood, the less she wanted to talk about it.
I knew enough that it wasn't popular, so then I was afraid that, one, people would think I was communist. So I always had to say, I'm from South Vietnam.
Now married for 21 years to her Springfield sweetheart and raising 2 children of her own, Jody's perspective has changed.
I am so grateful because regardless of the politics and the whatnot of the whole thing, if that didn't happen, I wouldn't be here today.
On this 40th anniversary, she is outspoken about her emotional journey.
I am a Christian, so God had a plan for me. Yeah. My husband says that God brought his wife all the way across 2 oceans so he could have me.
Gratitude shared by so many whose lives were changed forever by Operation Baby Lift.
Makes you think a little bit more about the videos we were showing from Afghanistan before the peace. You think about the baby girls living there now. We're going to be back after this. Keep sending in questions and comments. Use that hashtag HeyDan. All right, a question from Todd. We were talking about the catalytic converter and the new law where private businesses cannot do these transactions for a catalytic converter with any old Joe off the street. They have to use it through a commercial business. He said, well, why does it take until next year to put this law into effect? I like that question because it was the very first one I had this morning when we started doing this story. And it turns out the state said, well, because we're dealing with private businesses, they need to have time to get their ducks in a row and fully understand how they need to change their business. And typically the default for those new bills is the first of the year. So that's what we're seeing right here. I got an email from Nancy, and she was just a little concerned about all the COVID numbers rising and things like that. She said, why are we even considering sending kids back to school at all? Well, because we have a vaccine. Because there is you can get vaccinated. You can get vaccinated against COVID. Right? And yes, we're seeing breakthrough cases, but just to put them into perspective, James wrote in and said, in tonight's story on the surge in COVID hospitalizations, no mention was made of the number of those hospitalized who were unvaccinated. I understand that almost every person recently hospitalized with COVID was not vaccinated. Is that true? An overwhelming majority of the people going to the hospital are unvaccinated. But from OHSU, who say that their ICU is completely filled with COVID patients right now, none of them were vaccinated. So everybody in OHSU's ICU is an unvaccinated person. So I don't know. I was talking to the math majors off the top of the show. Do the math, folks. Just my opinion based on tons and tons of fact. That's the story for tonight. Thanks for being with us. See you tomorrow.